They told me to pray outside. Those words landed like a hymn gone wrong, thin and reverberating. My hands tightened around my purse until the leather creaked. The brooch at my collar, Thomas's wedding gift, pressed cold against my cardigan, the little gold cross glinting like an accusation. That morning started like any other Tuesday. The October sun slanted through the lace curtains in the kitchen, warm on the teacup rim. Chamomile steamed up in gentle curls. I smoothed my gray hair into a tidy bun, fingers remembering 100 mornings of Sunday coiffures. "You can do this, Evelyn," I told my own reflection, and tried to make my voice steady. Martha's call came at 8:47. Her voice was clipped, the way it goes when someone tries to hide something. "The council wants to see you at 10, she said. "It's about your program." She didn't say please. By the time I pulled into the church lot, the 6 cars of the council were lined like sentries. My chest ticked faster. The air smelled faintly of exhaust and damp leaves. Pastor Gregory met me in the hallway instead of the meeting room. He was immaculate, suit pressed, hair in place, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Evelyn, thank you for coming." His hands were folded as if in prayer, but there was an edge to the way he held them. "Then tell me," I said, "what is this about?" He shifted his gaze to the polished floorboards. "There are concerns about your literacy ministry." Concerns. The word tasted sour. What concerns? We teach people to read the Bible in basic English. We help them sign up for jobs, show them how to read letters from the school. What concerns? He inhaled slowly like a man who'd practiced this. "Some members have expressed discomfort with the number of Hispanic families using our facilities. Worthington sent a letter questioning whether the space is being used appropriately." Worthington. The megachurch on the highway, with the glossy banners and the pastor on TV. I felt something tight and old coil in my chest. "Appropriately," I said. My voice rose without my permission. "We're teaching mothers to read bedtime stories. We're helping men understand their employment contracts. Since when do we check immigration papers before we hand someone a hymnal?" His expression thinned. "Evelyn, the council needs to deliberate. Maybe it would be better if you prayed outside while we discuss." The hallway went cold. The walls seemed farther apart. My breath hitched. I put my palm flat against the glass of the meeting room door. Frosted, the way it always makes faces into ghosts. "Pray outside." I repeated. The sound I made might have been laughter. It might have been a sob. It was 17 minutes. I counted each one by the tick of the wall clock. Tick. Heavier. My hands went numb where I held my purse strap. The brooch warmed under my fingers from the heat of my skin. Voices filtered through the door, low-clipped. Once, Jecon Walter's voice rose like a gavel and then fell away. The door muffled everything but the cadence of the meeting. And then that odd, slow silence that comes right before a verdict. I stepped closer to the glass. The frosting blurred features into shapes. A head nodding, a hand lifting. Then another. A rhythm of hands going up. 1, 2, 3, 6. The motion felt like thunder behind paper. A unanimous vote. Without me. When the door opened, they all looked at me as if I were the interruption. Pastor Gregory held a blue folder. My program report inside. The pages I'd typed at midnight after tutoring and hospital visits. He looked down at it as if at evidence. "The council has decided to discontinue the literacy program," he said. His words were measured, rehearsed. "Space and resources must be focused on core ministries." "You asked me to wait outside so you could decide my fate," I said. The hallway answered my words with its cold, painted silence. 40 years here. Not even a chance to speak. "It's not personal, Evelyn." He avoided my eyes. I lifted my chin. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that. The Lord sees through doors." I walked out the front doors instead of the side alley the way I always did. The sunlight hit my face like a truth I hadn't asked for. My breath came in short, uneven pulls. In the parking lot, a van eased up, Maria with 3 children clutching notebooks, hopping down, cheeks flushed from the cold. They had been on their way to class. Her eyes found mine and widened with hope. Her smile broke me open. It has been a month since that hallway. I could have stayed. I could have shrunk into the parish and whispered forgiveness until it fit. Instead, we packed chalk, dictionaries, mismatched chairs. The Presbyterian Center down the street lent us a room with a hum of fluorescent lights and a sagging sofa. I pinned Thomas's cross to my cardigan each morning. Felt heavier some days, like a compass. Martha dropped by and, after a long look, said nothing. Then she started bringing volunteer sign-ups. Half of those women who had stepped back from the church stepped forward with us. Diakon Walter did not come. Pastor Gregory sent an email with platitudes and a calendar of prioritized ministries. I folded it and put it in the blue folder. On that first evening at the center, 30 faces waited under a single humming light. The air smelled of coffee and cold coats. Maria's youngest traced the cross on my brooch with sticky fingers. I felt the warmth of 100 small hands settle around me like a benediction. Outside, the church steeple caught the last of the sun and flashed like a distant coin. Inside, we opened our books. Sometimes being shut out of a door is how you learn there are windows. Sometimes, the people you come to serve become the ones who keep the light on. They told me to pray outside. Those words landed like a hymn gone wrong, thin and reverberating. My hands tightened around my purse until the leather creaked. The brooch at my collar, Thomas's wedding gift, pressed cold against my cardigan, the little gold cross glinting like an accusation. My loves, thank you for giving me a few quiet minutes of your day to hear this. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber is a breath of life as we reach for our first 1,000. If this story moves you, please hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from. I read every single one. 2 days before they told me to pray outside. I was standing at my kitchen sink watching steam curl from a chipped teacup. The October light came thin through the lace curtains, painting the countertop in soft gold. I pinched my fingers on the rim of the cup until the chamomile smell steadied me. Thomas's brooch weighed its familiar cold against the left side of my cardigan. I touched it without thinking, as if it answered a question I hadn't quite formed. I am 68. I say that aloud sometimes to remind myself I've earned the quiet mornings, the slow deliberation of a life that once hurried. For 40 years this church has been my rhythm. I taught Sunday school, folded more bulletins than I can count, sat with families at bedsides and weddings. After Thomas died, the literacy program gave me a reason to leave the house that wasn't only habit. It gave me new hands to hold and new mouths to hear. And in many small ways it returned my laughter. On Tuesday mornings I get to the fellowship hall early. The floorboards smell of lemon cleaner and old varnish. The long folding tables have nicks and coffee rings. The plastic chairs scream when you slide them into place. I like that sound, it means people will sit. I set out dictionaries, a stack of yellow Bible pages with simple verses, crayons and a tin. I arrange the chairs in a loose circle, like a conversation waiting to happen. I always leave an empty chair near the window, where the light is best, for anyone who comes late. It's a habit born of more than courtesy. It's hope. The first week we had 3 students. By the end of the month we were a small congregation of our own. Maria came the 3rd week, her hair damp from the bus, her children clinging to the hem of her coat. She brought a thermos of coffee and a handful of determination. Her notebooks were immaculate, the margins full of questions. When her youngest traced the tiny cross on my brooch with sticky fingers, my throat tightened. Those hands felt like a promise. People noticed. Some noticed with warm eyes and casseroles. Martha noticed with a terse email about room scheduling and a hesitant phone call. There've been a few comments, she said, folding the corner of her note as if that would make the words less sharp. Her face held the mild worry of someone who has seen. Small things started to shift. Diakon Walter began sitting a little straighter at committee meetings, his watch glinting like a metronome. At the last business meeting he cleared his throat and said something about priorities, programs that serve our membership first. His words landed like coins in a jar. Pastor Gregory, who'd always been smooth around the edges, began to move through the church like someone who checks his reflection in the window before entering. He'd been here 3 years, came with credentials and a past at Worthington. He smiled at me in the foyer last Sunday and his hand stayed a fraction too long on my shoulder. "Evelyn, your work is appreciated," he said. His eyes, though, they flicked past me to the steeple, to people with larger checks and louder voices. I didn't read malice in it then. I read practicality. I still wanted to believe. The fellowship hall curtain, faded red, sun-bleached along the top, always hangs a little crooked. On mornings when the wind is right you can hear the bell from the steeple, a clear note that lifts everything for a moment. That crooked curtain and that bell felt like the scaffolding of my days. I'd catch the bell sound and think, someone is coming. Someone needs a chair. There were mornings when worry sat beside me like a small, polite guest. I would thumb through the attendance sheets and find a name I didn't recognize. A surname with letters I knew how to pronounce but not the stories behind. I learned the cadence of other lives through those names. I learned Maria's silence after she received a court notice about work hours. I learned Mr. Alvarez's love for the gospel when he read the Psalms aloud, slow and sure. Those moments braided the program into the church more than any paperwork ever could. Yet even as we put out sign-up sheets and laminated flashcards, a different sort of plumbing was being laid beneath the church. Conversations behind closed doors, a ledger of concerns that grew quietly in corners. I remember touching the hymn book where someone had tucked a folded page in Spanish and English. The paper was soft with use. I smoothed it with the back of my hand like a blessing. On the morning of the meeting I was ironing a skirt, the iron hissing like distant rain. The light through the lace curtains looked thinner than usual, as if someone had turned down the day's brightness. Martha's call came, clipped, practiced. "The council wants to see you at 10, she said. She didn't have to say more. The air in my chest tightened the way it does before a storm. I left the house with my brooch pinned tight. I kissed the framed photo of Thomas on the mantel because habit makes a kind of prayer, and because some promises need a touch to remember them. On the walk to the car, the bell tolled once, clear and honest. I held that sound in my mouth like a taste and stepped toward the church, not knowing that the door ahead would ask me to stand outside. He told me to pray outside. Those 3 words landed in the hallway like a slammed hymn book, and the air went thin around them. My fingers clenched the strap of my purse until the leather bit into my palm. I could feel the brooch at my collar, Thomas's cross, press cold through the fabric, as if it were trying to say something steady and holy I couldn't hear. The hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and old varnish, the scent catching something in my throat that made me swallow. Pastor Gregory's eyes slipped away from mine the way a tide withdraws from the shore. His suit was immaculate. His voice was not. It trembled with a careful politeness that didn't reach his tone. "Maybe it's best if you pray out here while we discuss," he said, the words wrapped like tissue paper around a knife. My mouth went dry. I could feel the blood at the back of my neck, hot and dangerous. For a moment everything else narrowed to that one implausible instruction. Pray outside. As if prayer were a curtain you could draw across a person and make them smaller, less important. "One of the members raised concerns," he added, as if that settled the geometry of the room. "Space, resources, security." His hands were folded as if in prayer. Mine went to my cardigan pockets where my fingers found the cold of my house keys. "Security?" I asked. The sound of my voice startled me. Thinner than I expected, and threading with something like indignation. "We teach mothers to read. We teach men to understand their job letters. We don't ask people where they were born before we hand them a pencil. He smiled then, a small practiced lift of the mouth. It was a smile I'd learned to read as diplomacy, not cruelty. Please, Evelyn. Just for a few minutes. He closed the door behind him with that soft final click. It sounded like a verdict. I stood in the corridor counting the clock above the office door because counting gives a kind of order to panic. Tick. 1. Tick. 2. The paint on the hallway bench was chipped in the same spot where I'd once sat with Martha filling out a volunteer sheet. I traced the chip with my thumb without meaning to. The brooch warmed against my collarbone from my trembling skin. My breath came short and thin. My knees felt like the knees of someone much older than 68. Muffled voices leaked through the frosted glass of the meeting room, low even. Jekon Walter's baritone rose and fell like a metronome and then fell away. I stepped closer and pressed my forehead to the pane as if proximity could sharpen the shapes behind it. The frosting made everyone a silhouette. A head nodding, two shoulders leaning, hands in shadow. Then I saw the hands. One hand rose, slow, purposeful. Another followed. A rhythm, vote, 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 and each motion looked smaller and smaller under the layer of glass, until it felt like something shrinking away from me. 1, 2, 3, 6. The number landed in my chest like a stone. Unanimous. Time folded in on itself. The hallway's ordinary hum, the fluorescent buzz, the echo of a closing door, the distant clink of a coffee cup, became a chorus that laughed at me. 17 minutes, I remembered later. 17 minutes of being relegated to the margins, while the thing I had built with my own hands was stripped away. When they opened the door, they looked like people interrupting a conversation. Pastor Gregory held a blue folder in front of him. It was the one with my attendance sheets and budget notes. The one I'd stayed up late compiling so the council would understand the lives behind the numbers. He looked at the folder like a judge reads a file. The council has decided to discontinue the literacy program, he said, as if reading minutes from a benign meeting. The words were practiced. They were meant to be gentle. My shoulders rolled back without my consent. My voice came out level but not calm. You asked me to wait outside so you could decide my fate. There was a rustle of papers. Jekon Walter's watch flashed in the light. Nobody shifted to meet my eyes. The room felt smaller than the hallway, and their resolve looked brittle when held up next to my astonishment. It's not personal, Evelyn, Pastor Gregory said softly, as if that could unburden the wrongness of closing a door while someone stood at it. I thought of Thomas's hand when he'd pinned the brooch on me all those years ago, the way he'd mumbled a blessing and a joke. I thought of Maria's notebooks, the jagged pencil marks where a child had tried to copy a letter into a margin, the way the smallest hands had reached for my brooch as if it were a talisman. I felt the heat of shame rise in me like steam. Don't say that, I said. Don't ever say it. My voice snapped harder than I'd intended. The Lord sees through doors. They didn't answer. They had rehearsed their silence. I left through the front doors because the sidestep felt like an act of cowardice I couldn't perform. The sunlight hit my face and it was too bright, a chastening. My skin prickled. In the parking lot, a van rolled up and eased to a stop. Maria jumped out. 3 little notebooks hugged to her chest, breath fogging in the cold. Her cheeks were flushed with a hope that didn't yet know it had been wounded. She waved, the kind of quick, bright wave that empties a container in your breast. Her smile found my face before I'd smoothed the betrayal into anything like composure. For a beat I could only look at her, at those expectant children, at the neat stack of notebooks that meant the world to them. My knees stopped shaking, not because the outrage had faded but because something else moved in its place. A stubborn insistence. If they would close the door, we would find a window. If our own church could not shelter these people any longer, then we would make shelter where we could. Martha appeared a moment later, her face a relief and a reproach. She didn't say, "I told you." She said quietly, "Where will you go?" Her hands were steady. Her eyes, the deep brown I trusted, filled and then cleared. I touched the brooch at my collar like finding a compass. We'll start at the brooch always knows where I keep my truth. Sometimes I press my thumb to it and the metal is cool, like a coin pulled from a river. Other times it warms under my skin, heated by whatever tremor is living in my chest that day. The week after the vote, it was warm for all the wrong reasons. Martha arrived at the Presbyterian Center carrying her purse and a thermos, but her shoulders were the thing I noticed first. She held them like someone braced against a draft. She didn't come in with the brisk efficiency of the church office. She came as if she'd rehearsed this hour a dozen times and still didn't know how to start. Eve. She slid into the sagging sofa like it might bite. Her smile was apologetic. Her fingers found mine and stayed there longer than politeness required. I'm sorry. Her apology was small and heavy. There was more in her face. Calculation, shame, loyalty folded inward. She mouthed things she wouldn't say out loud. I watched her hand smooth her skirt, watched the way she bit a lip before she let herself speak. I tried, she said finally. The words were a whisper that landed like a stone. I told them what you do. I said it matters. I could see the office behind her eyes, the stack of tithing envelopes, the little calendar with birthdays circled in pencil. She'd worked there long enough to know which way the wind blew when the big men walked in. Her silence had weight. Her presence now was a confession. Do you think they knew what they were doing? She asked, and the question came out softer than a prayer. Martha's breath hitched. Some of them did. Some of them were scared. She looked at the floor, then up at me with that look that says, I don't know how to fix what I helped break. Walter set priorities. Pastor Gregory kept his hands folded like a man rehearsing patience. He looked past you like past you was safer. My throat tightened at the name. Diakon Walter, suit always pressed, watch shining voice used to being heard. I remembered him at the last business meeting, the way his jaw set when he said, we must serve our membership first. He said it like that settled the ledger of souls. But when Maria's boy mispronounced a word and laughed, I heard a different sermon in my head. Martha swallowed. After they closed the door, she didn't finish. Her eyes filled and then cleared, pragmatic as ever. She folded and refolded a volunteer form, and then slid it across the coffee table toward me. We started a sign-up list. Half of the women from the church came. That was what broke me in the best way. Small, ordinary betrayals had tried to snuff out what we'd built, but ordinary acts of courage. A casserole delivered, a late-night email, a hand folding chairs, rebuilt it in other rooms. Volunteers who'd quietly sat in the back of Sunday worship showed up with thermoses and patience. They came with worn dictionaries and a readiness to learn how to teach again. Maria arrived next. Cheeks bright from the cold, 3 notebooks hugged to her chest like something sacred. Her fingers left a scent of detergent and bus fumes on the chair arm. When her youngest reached for my brooch and traced the little cross with sticky fingers, something inside me loosened. I felt the climb of months of worry recede in that small sticky loop of a child's curiosity. Do you think they'll stop us? Maria asked later, voice low as if the walls themselves might repeat the word stop. She tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear and watched me like a woman looking for a map. No, the answer came steady, not because I had no fear, but because I'd begun to know what courage looked like in practice. They can close doors. They can vote and sign minutes. But people still need to read the letter from the school. They still need to tell their employers when they're sick. We'll teach them. We'll find tables and windows. There was, of course, the other side of that afternoon that lived in my chest like a bruise. I kept replaying the hour in the hallway, Gregory's measured words, the soft click of the door, the rhythm of hands rising through the frosted glass. I remembered the way the blue folder looked in his hands, how he opened it like it contained a verdict he had the right to hand down. His smile at the end was practiced, the sort of practiced warmth that never reaches the eyes. When he said, "It's not personal," I felt all the ways it had been. Deacon Walter didn't come to the center. His absence was a statement in itself, a polished silence. I saw him later at the grocery, talking with other men from the church, his posture straighter than it used to be. His glance slid past me like a curtain. It stung. It also clarified things. Some people protect institutions in the way others protect children, fiercely, and sometimes to the point of cruelty. There were quiet reckonings, too. One morning a woman from the congregation I'd never recognized came with 2 folding chairs, and the kind of hands that had belonged to a nurse. She didn't make a scene. She set the chairs by the window, smoothed a tablecloth, and stayed. Later she told me, "My mother used to teach night school. She taught me to never let a soul go illiterate when you can help." Her voice was simple. Her presence profound. We found our rhythm in the hum of fluorescent lights and the scrape of plastic chairs. The Presbyterian Center lent us a key and a photocopier that coughed like an old man. We learned how to stack chairs to make room for story time. We learned how to laugh when a child misread faith as faint, and then tried to make it make sense. Each small correction felt like a brick laid against the cold. At night I sit on my porch and sometimes I can hear the faint echo of that fellowship hall bell. Like something from another life. I touch the brooch and feel the scar where it pressed against my chest that morning in the hallway. The pain is there, honest and sharp. But it mixes now with other things. The smell of chalk dust, the hush of a child sounding out a new word, the weight of a volunteer's hand in mine as we fold up chairs together. We were asked to pray outside. We prayed and then we opened books. We kept teaching, one lesson, one stubborn, unglamorous hour at a time. And with each one the wound softened. Some wounds don't close, they become maps. I keep mine pinned close because it reminds me who I serve, and why I learned to keep walking even when the door was shut. After the vote, the world inside that town narrowed to the width of a doorway. At first it was almost polite, a cough where a hello should be, a steadying of the hands on a casserole lid as if the weight of a dish could steer a conversation away from whatever had happened in the fellowship hall. Then the looks grew colder, and the quiet found a habit. I noticed it first in the pews. I'd gone back one Sunday, curious and foolish, to hear the hymns that had been the soundtrack of my life. I chose the last row, the way I always did when I wanted to slip in unnoticed. The hymn book I opened smelled of church powder and lemon polish. People filed past like a river of eyes. Where there used to be nods, there were quick glances that slid away, as if someone had lowered the shutters on a house. A woman I'd once taught to fold bulletins, a woman with a laugh like a bell, passed within arm's reach and pretended to look for an empty hymnal. Her shoulder brushed mine and she didn't look back. It felt like a hand closing over a small private throat. Whispers started to gather like storm clouds in the foyer. They were never direct, they never had to be. A hedged question at coffee hour. "Isn't that Evelyn Rhodes?" Followed by a pivot of shoulders and a shift of conversation toward something safer. The bake sale, the nursery schedule. Once I overheard 2 men leaning against the counter, speaking low enough that I almost believed they weren't speaking about me. "It's about resources," one said, his voice as smooth as a well-oiled hinge. "Can't let things spread." They used words like spread and security, as if reading a recipe that excused whatever came next. Pastor Gregory's emails arrived with the same soft varnish as his smile. "We must guard our mission," one read. "Prioritization of ministries is essential." It was a mild sort of exile, wrapped in Christian language, and it landed in my mailbox like a polite eviction notice. He never looked me in the eye after the meeting. When our gazes happened to meet, and it was always accidental, across at the grocery aisle, his cart a country away from mine. He kept looking at the steeple behind me as if the church were a horizon he'd rather stare at than the person who'd come through its doors for 4 decades. Deacon Walter's avoidance had a different edge. Where others shrank away, he moved around me with the certainty of someone who had practiced omission like a prayer. At a community dinner he sat at the head table with his watch face catching the light and pretended not to see when I passed with a tray. Later, I heard him telling someone else about priorities. Strangers were kinder. At the Presbyterian Center, Maria's presence was an antidote to the sour air around town. Her smile was open, her children's laughter a bridge across any hostility. But every time I walked past the First Baptist on my way to the center, I felt the building's eyes on me. Windows that would not meet mine, a bell that tolled but did not call me back. Doors that once opened wide now closed a half-second sooner. People would turn as if closing the world's books to my page. Even errands became a field of tiny refusals. At the post office, a man in line slid his packages closer to him when I reached the counter. At the supermarket, an acquaintance who used to stop and ask after my knees and my tomatoes now breezed past. A hand raised in a shape that was almost nothing. It's a peculiar thing, to be treated as though you might smudge someone's reputation simply by existing near their casserole. Gossip lit itself on the smallest sparks. A Sunday school teacher, whose children I'd once welcomed into my living room, offered a half-hearted hello and then excused herself with the busyness that smelled like contrivance. A neighbor who'd once brought over soup when Thomas was sick sent a card that said, "Thinking of you," and nothing more. Each omission was small. Strung together, they were a rope knotted around my days. The strangest part was how quickly shame became public property. People who had once sought my counsel now watched me as if I might crumble and stain their good attendance records. I felt my life listed in a ledger I hadn't known existed, each line measured against committees and donor lists and an imagined fear. At town events, conversation stopped as I approached. Eyes averted. Chairs scooted away. I could feel the silence pressing thin and loud as a drum. And yet, the siege had cracks. Volunteers from the church who could not bear the way the meeting had been held slipped quietly across the street to the center. A few men from the choir, embarrassed, apologetic, brought dictionaries and stayed. They came with hands that trembled and faces that reddened with the heat of being wrong. Their arrival felt like a small liturgy of repair. But the pressure of the rest pressed on. There were nights I sat alone on my porch, the brooch at my collar cold and heavy, and I would count the small doors that had closed in my life. Each one left an outline, a shape of a former conversation, a friend's smile. The town was full of people who used to be my church family. Now they were a congregation of polite distance. I learned to measure myself not by the pews that turned away, but by the rooms that kept their lights on. Even as the town folded its hands against me, a handful of brave ones pushed tables into corners and lent keys without question. Their courage did not erase the ache of being shut out. It did something steadier. It taught me how to keep going when the chorus turned its back. The isolation tightened its grip with every passing day. And every day, quietly, we answered with a chair and a story and a pen. They told me to pray outside. The words hang in the hallway like a verse that won't finish. And I do what I'm told because what else do you do when the pastor asks and the room is already full of men who have decided you should be smaller? I lean my forehead against the frosted glass because being closer feels like doing something. Anything. My breath fogs the pain. On the other side, the meeting is a slow drumming sound. A chair scraped, a cough, the low, measured breathing of people who have already rehearsed the end. The hall smells of lemon cleaner and varnish, the same smell that always makes me think of hymnals and folded bulletins, and beneath it something metallic like the blue folder Pastor Gregory carries. The folder has my name on it in a neat serif, the proof of a life I worked nights to write into numbers and attendance sheets. Pastor Gregory's voice comes through the glass first. Smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that sounds like it could sell church growth strategies on television. He speaks of resource allocation and core ministries, and the way he pronounces the words makes them sound like scripture. There's a vibration to it that goes right through the wood of the building. His hands are folded in that way he uses when he wants people to think he's praying. I can see the shadow of his profile, the set of his jaw. He speaks like a man delivering a sermon where the congregation already knows the hymn. Deacon Walter's voice is different, thick and clipped, like a hammer on oak. When he speaks, the sound comes out as a small, sharp punctuation, decisive as a gavel. I can't make out everything, but I can hear the cadence. Priorities, security, membership. Every time he says those words, a little cold gathers behind my ribs. The meeting room becomes a drum and my pulse follows its beat. I straighten. My fingers are in my purse, knuckles white. The brooch at my collar presses into the wool of my cardigan, cold and familiar, and I keep touching it as if it will steady me. My hands are folded the way I taught my first Sunday school class to fold them. Gentle, reverent. I force myself to breathe slow, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The rafters of the hallway hum with fluorescent light. I count the ticks of the old clock because counting makes the world orderly, and panic hates order. A door elsewhere creaks like a hinge complaining. A candle on the meeting table. Someone must have placed it for the prayer before the vote, blinks. The wick shivers once, then goes out with a tiny sigh, the smoke curling like a question mark. It's a small thing, but it feels like a sentence being struck from a book. My jaw tightens. The muffled voices shift. Someone clears his throat. Pastor Gregory's tone drops. It becomes the tone of a man about to read a verdict. I press my cheek harder to the glass and the frosting blurs their faces into saints and villains in the same breath. Then I see them. A hand lifts. Deliberate. Slow. Walter's hand follows. Another. Another. The motion is almost ritual, one by one, hands answering whatever question has been asked without me. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm cements like a stamp on damp paper. I count them like beads and the number keeps growing. 6. Unanimous. The sound of hands raised is absurdly loud through the glass, muffled but emphatic. It is the action of a church in miniature. A choir of agreement without chorus. The motion makes something inside me clack like a wooden crucifix struck. The little metal cross at my breast feels suddenly heavier, as if the metal is anchoring me to a place I no longer belong. Something thumps against the wall, metal on wood, like the blue folder being set down with purpose. The room falls into a peculiar hush that is not prayerful, only administrative. Then the click of the door. The click is small, ordinary, but when it closes it feels like the front door on a marriage, the finality of a gavel. They open the door and they look at me as if I am a misplaced hymn book. Pastor Gregory holds the blue folder up like a script. His smile is the same one he wears at potlucks. The eyes don't match. The council has voted to discontinue the literacy program, he says. The words come out slow, even, as if reading minutes from a meeting where sympathy was part of the agenda. I feel the floor tilting under me. For a moment I have the absurd sensation of looking at my life from across a table, my hands folded, my throat working, the brooch glinting like a coin. I think of Thomas, of the way he pinned this cross on me and mumbled something about doing good. I think of Maria's notebooks, of little hands tracing letters, of someone's son finally reading the word his mother had practiced with him at the sink. All those small proofs of worth stack up in me like plates, and suddenly they want to take them away and tell me there is no room. You asked me to wait outside so you could decide my fate, I say. The words come out cleaner than I feel. My voice is steady, not because I am calm but because there is no stage for hysteria in a hallway where the fluorescent light watches everything. It's not personal, Evelyn, Pastor Gregory replies, the old phrase like a benediction that doesn't bless. Don't say that, I tell him. Not personal is exactly what makes it personal. The hallway closes in. My breath is all there is to hold on to. My hands unclasp, then clasp again like a prayer. The crucifix at my chest feels cold, then warm, then a weight. Behind us, the church bell gives a single thin note, timid, ordinary, and in the parking lot a van eases to a stop. Through the gap in the doorway I can see Maria, bundled and hopeful, 3 notebooks hugged to her chest as if they were parcels of promise. Her eyes find mine across the distance and she smiles, small and certain, and it breaks whatever shape the moment was trying to force me into. The door of the fellowship hall closes behind me as if it had been waiting to do so. The sound is a finality and also an invitation. The crucifix, Martha didn't bring it up at first. She came the way she always came now, late, skirt smoothed, a thermos that smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon. We had been moving chairs and stapling handouts for the next class, the ordinary work that keeps people alive. Names on attendance sheets, a marker for the whiteboard that never quite washed clean. The fluorescent lights hummed over us like an indifferent sky. She set a manila envelope on the table between us. The sound of it sliding across the laminate felt louder than it should, like a bell. For a long beat we only looked at it. Her fingers folded over the flap as if she could close what was inside. "You kept it," I said, "because there are things people who work in church offices keep and there are things they don't." Her face pinched into that careful look she wears when she wants to say something and doesn't know whether it will mend or break. "I kept more than one thing," she whispered. I thought maybe it wasn't mine to say. Her voice broke on the last word, small and human. But then I started bringing volunteers. And I couldn't. She opened the envelope. Inside were 2 sheets. A letter on Worthington letterhead, and beneath it a forwarded email thread. The letter was what had worried us before, polite, the kind of thing that smells like money. Proper use, protocol, shared resources. The email thread beneath it was sharper. Pastor Gregory, copied to a handful of people I recognized by their titles, wrote in a tone I had heard before in potlucks and board meetings, diplomatic, precise. Then in a later message, someone from Worthington suggested language about guarding our membership and donor base. The words were clinical, but the meaning was naked. I felt my breath go shallow. The envelope slipped a little in Martha's hand. Paper rustled. The paper smelled faintly of old printer toner and coffee. It was, in the smallest way, proof, not of a conspiracy in the melodramatic sense, but of a choice. A line to follow. A reason not dressed up in faith speak. We voted because of space, Walter would later tell anyone who asked. But here was a chain that showed the nudge, the hand hovering over the scale. It did not absolve anyone of responsibility. It only made the pattern visible. We did not shout. We did not stage a dramatic confrontation. That is not how small towns unspool or mend. Martha and I sat at the table while the light hummed and she told me, haltingly, how she had found the thread on an office computer she sometimes used to print bulletin inserts. How she had seen the name of the Worthington pastor on the CC line, and felt the room tilt. How she had sat on the truth until her own hands started to ache from carrying both the ledger and the lie. "I should have told you," she said. "I was scared. For my job. For what people would think of me." She looked at me like someone asking for mercy. What came next was quiet and inevitable. We decided to do what we had always done, name people and needs. We called the women who'd signed the volunteer list. We called Maria. We made enough flyers to hand out at the grocery store and the library. We asked the Presbyterian Center for another evening. We told the story simply. We showed the paper. People came. Some came because they had been there the day I'd read to a row of small children. Some came because they hated the idea of someone being told to step out of a room while men decided their future. A few came from the First Baptist, faces flushed with the heat of having been wrong. Martha sat at the front, fingers clenched, and when she spoke she did not beg. She told the truth about the email thread, about the pressure from outside, about what it felt like to sign her name to a bulletin and feel the paper tremble. Pastor Gregory did not join us. He sent a bland letter about prioritization and a promise to reevaluate. Diakon Walter refused to meet with anyone who had the audacity to return his calls. That was the part of it that was small and human. People make choices and then they live with the ripples. But the ripples carried something else. Neighbors who had been quiet in the pews began to show up with dictionaries. A man from the choir who'd sung alto for 40 years brought a stack of children's books from his basement. A woman I had taught to fold bulletins came with homemade soup, and a willingness to sit in a corner and alphabetize flashcards until her fingers cramped. We did not get the church back. The council did not reverse the vote. That was never the point for me. The point was that truth loosened something like a hinge. People who had let fear make parishioners of them found themselves needing to answer for it. Some apologized, awkward and earnest. Some left the church in ways that were quieter than I would have imagined. Not angry, simply no longer present to avoid seeing the faces of those they'd pushed away. The program grew. We moved into the community room at the Presbyterian Center, and then into an old storefront donated by a woman who had learned to read at night school. We doubled our class sizes. Maria became my assistant. Her smallest started reading aloud in December, and the first time he sounded the word mother correctly, there were 10 people in the room with wet eyes and breath held. I have never been able to say whether that moment was victory or grace. Felt like both. Martha kept working in the church office, but differently. She volunteered more openly with us. Once, in the lull between classes, she told me she'd put copies of the email on the pastor's desk at Worthington and sent a note asking for accountability. She didn't tell me whether she expected an answer. She told me she needed to do it to keep from waking up in the night with her hands knotted. Standing at the front of that room, chalk in hand, I felt the brooch grow warm against my collarbone. It was no longer just a token of a past life. It was a pin that held the map of what I'd been asked to do: teach, protect, keep faith simple and not cruel. There are quiet kinds of justice. There is not always a public reckoning that unfurls in dramatic headlines. Sometimes justice is the sound of chairs being set, of names being written on a sign-up sheet, of a woman learning the word for doctor, and being able to say it without trembling. The weight left my shoulders not because the church said I was right, but because the people who mattered, the ones whose lives we touched, looked me in the eye and kept coming back. We were not the same as before. The First Baptist door still seemed to watch me when I passed them. Diakon Walter still kept his place at the head table. Pastor Gregory's smile remained lacquered. But down the block, in an old storefront with flaking paint and a heater that clicked too loudly, we kept our lights on. Children learned to read. Parents learned to sign forms. A woman named Rosa learned to write her name for the first time. Martha took my hand one evening when we were locking up. "You were right to keep going," she said simply. I pinched the brooch between my fingers. The metal was cool, then warmed as I breathed. Sometimes being asked to pray outside is the world's way of telling you to find a better room, I said. My voice was small, but it steadied. We turned out the lights, carried the chairs to the van, and the sound of the door closing felt less like a cut and more like a beginning. The church is quieter now. Not the deep hush of prayer, but a small habitual silence that lives in the corners. The church foyer where coats used to brush shoulders, the fellowship hall where folding chairs still have the ghost of a scrape. I walk by sometimes because habit is a kind of devotion. The bench by the entrance is empty. The varnish wears a pale crescent where people used to sit and wait for coffee. I put my palm on that worn wood and it feels like a page turned. There used to be clatter there. Hymnals sliding, casseroles being set down, laughter that smelled of sugar and Sunday. Now the church bell rings and it is a distant thing, polite and uninsistent. It tolls and I think of the classroom at the Presbyterian Center. Fluorescent lights humming, a crooked whiteboard with marker ghosts, little chairs pulled in close to a table. There is noise there too, but it is the kind of noise that builds rather than divides. A child sounding out a letter, someone asking how to read a bus schedule, the soft scrape of a pencil on paper. On the day they closed the program, the bench in the hallway felt like a verdict. Today it feels like a place where a story once paused. A bouquet of mothballed hymnals sits on the lower shelf, a ribbon of dust between them. I brush it away with my thumb the way I used to smooth a page for someone learning to hold a book. The brooch at my collar, Thomas's cross, taps the fabric when I move. I press my fingers against it, the metal cool and then warm, and I can track the memory by the heat. Sometimes when the light hits the hall just so, I can see the frosted glass where the meeting took place. It is plain when you look at it from the curb, ordinary and sun-bleached. Up close, I think about doors. How heavy they feel when they close. How soundable the click can be. Small as a coin dropped into a bowl. Loud as a gavel. The front doors of First Baptist seem to remember me. They sigh a little when people go in and out. Once they opened wide for me without question. After the vote they closed a fraction sooner. As if timing could keep history from catching up. I notice the gap when I pass, but I do not let it shape my steps. When I walk away I hear my feet on the pavement, soft, steady. Maria's van used to idle in the lot. Notebooks stacked like promises on the passenger seat. The van is still there sometimes, older and dented and stubborn as a hymn sung off-key. Maria waves from her driver's window with the same nervous hope she had the first night she came. Her children have grown a little. The smallest now reads aloud and loves the sound of his own voice. I listen to their laughter glide across the street, and it steadies me more than any sermon ever did. The wind knows how to close things too. On some evenings it arrives as a careful hand, shoving a door until it clicks shut, rustling the prayer cards on the church bulletin board. On others it rushes like apology, pushing letters from hymnals into the gutters and lifting a stray flyer into the air. Once, after a long day of class, I stood outside the First Baptist and felt the wind close the door behind someone who had left without looking back. It sounded like an ending and also like a choice. Inside our little storefront classroom, the door creaks in a friendly, familiar way. We open it and close it and open it again because people come in late and people leave early. And the work of teaching is a rhythm of arrivals and departures. Chairs are stacked against the wall like back row saints. The whiteboard has a smudge in the corner where someone tried to write the letter R with the wrong pressure and laughed. Chalk dust settles on my cardigan and rubs off into the folds of my pockets like memory. There are small rituals now that stitch the days together. Martha arrives with a thermos that smells of cinnamon and a calm that is almost fierce. She puts her purse down and checks the sign-in sheet as if it were an altar. She still works at the church office, and the two worlds sometimes overlap like pages in a well-thumbed book. We fold chairs together, our hands finding the same cadence. Once, after everyone left, she squeezed my fingers and didn't say anything more than, "You were right. The nights are the smallest kind of poem." I sit on my front step and press the brooch with my thumb. The street lamp paints a thin cross of light on the pavement. In the dark I can hear the hum of fluorescent lights at the center, the sound of someone rehearsing a lesson. Once, in the quiet, I could hear Maria's son practicing the M in mother from blocks away. His voice clear and brave. The sound stitched the bruise the vote left into something gentler. An empty bench is not a punishment. It is an invitation. It remembers who sat there and keeps the memory clean. A few feet away the walk continues, past the church, past the storefront, past the grocery where neighbors bring us dictionaries in paper bags. The town keeps turning its pages. We keep turning ours. They told me to pray outside. I did. I bowed my head in that cold hallway and breathed until the breath was steady again. Then I stood up, picked up a stack of books and walked toward a door that would open. The wind closed behind me, and somewhere ahead a child sounded a letter out loud. The sound held and I kept walking. I still touch the brooch sometimes, the little gold cross Thomas gave me on our 25th anniversary. It's a habit that feels like prayer. Cold at first, then warming against my skin with whatever heat I'm carrying that day. It anchors me. And it reminds me how odd it is that objects remember better than people sometimes do. After the vote, the town shifted in ways that weren't loud but were unmistakable. Doors closed a fraction sooner. Conversations thinned. People I had stood beside at bedsides and potlucks folded into polite distances. It hurt, of course it hurt. Shame is a small thing that spreads where laughter used to be. But grief didn't swallow me. It redirected me. At the Presbyterian Center, the fluorescent lights buzzed like a committed choir. The whiteboard still had marker shadows from lessons past. We stacked chairs and made a semicircle. Maria's children came with their notebooks, edges frayed from practice and hope. Their pencils made a sound like a promise when they pressed into paper. Every time a child sounded a new letter out loud, it felt like a small private resurrection. I'd been present at a lot of quiet awakenings in my life. The first time a teenager sings harmony without shaking, the way an old woman's hand relaxes at the memory of a prayer, and these were of that same cloth. Martha surprised me in ways I didn't expect. She kept her job in the church office, but she let her loyalties be more complicated than the minutes of a meeting. She slid volunteer lists across my table and then, one evening, handed me an envelope. Inside were a handful of emails, polite phrases on letterhead, a thread that showed the outside pressure and the inside decisions. She told me she'd held on to them because the truth sometimes needs time to be born. She did not say she had been brave. She said she had been afraid, and then she stayed. Some of the women from First Baptist came. Not all, but enough. They carried casseroles and dictionaries, eyes down and hands full. A few men from the choir showed up with children's books they tucked away in basements. They blushed and mumbled apologies that looked like they might straighten into something steady. Deacon Walter did not come. Pastor Gregory wrote a letter about prioritization. Those gestures were small remedies, more varnish than restoration. But life is often stitched together in small things. An extra tray of soup, a night of lesson plans, a woman staying up late to copy flashcards. We didn't get the church meeting reversed. That wasn't the point anymore. The point became the work itself. The point was Maria's youngest finally sounding out M in mother, and the room holding its breath like a congregation waiting for an amen. The point was a man who'd been too afraid to ask for help learning to read his pay stub without fear. The point was that people learned that the word doctor wasn't a monster but a tool. There were nights when the bench in the First Baptist hallway felt like an accusation. I would pass, and the varnished wood would remember the shape of my palm. Sometimes I put my hand on it and let the memory sit where it belonged. It's healthy, I think, to let places remember us without letting the memory erode who we are. I learned to measure the town not by the pews that turned away, but by the rooms that kept their lights on. Our new classroom wasn't pretty. The heater ticked like an old man clearing his throat. The linoleum had seen better decades. But children learned to sound words. Mothers learned to read school notes. Men learned to decipher a letter from an employer. That work, unglamorous and stubborn, felt like prayer too. Sometimes grace arrives in the least theatrical ways. A neighbor who had stopped speaking to me for a few weeks returned with a bag of well-worn children's books. A woman who had avoided me in the grocery line slipped a dictionary into my hands and mouthed, "I'm sorry." Small apologies like those lay mortar between the stones of things that had cracked. There were moments I still replay in the dark, the soft click of the fellowship hall door, the hands lifting through the frosted glass, the blue folder like a small judge. Those things sat in me like bruises. But bruises fade into a map if you keep moving. They tell you where you were hurt and, if you're lucky, where to put the next step. I taught my classes the way I always had. Patient, concrete, with plenty of repetition. We drew simple sentences and read them aloud. We practiced filling out forms. We learned together the vocabulary of everyday dignity. Watching someone write their name for the first time is as holy to me as any sacrament. The light over the table makes the pencil lead shine like something holy. Martha stayed. Maria became my right hand. A few volunteers from the church who could not live with how the decision had been made walked across the street and sat down with us. The work kept us honest and busy. It taught me that being asked to step outside the room sometimes means you have to build a new room and invite people in. I don't pretend everything healed. Some faces never returned. Pastor Gregory kept his smile. Deacon Walter kept his posture. The town kept being complicated. But inside a thrift store storefront with a crooked sign, We kept our lights on and our chairs open. We kept teaching. We kept being present. Sometimes when the night is still, I hear a child in the building next door practicing the letter he's just learned. The sound crosses the street like a benediction. I press my thumb to Thomas's brooch and feel its metal grow warm. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.